It's a Saturday morning in 1974, and in driveways across America, teenagers are hunched over cars that cost less than a modern smartphone, armed with nothing but a socket set, a case of Schlitz their older brother bought them, and an unshakable belief that they could turn a rusted-out Nova into something that mattered. This wasn't about money. Most of these kids didn't have any. This was about identity, about carving out a piece of the American road that belonged to nobody but them, using whatever they could scrounge from the auto parts store, the junkyard, or their dad's garage. And what they built, one cheap modification at a time, became the visual language of an entire generation. Let's start with the sound, because in the 1970s, before you ever saved a car, you heard it coming. The Glasspack muffler was the great equalizer of teenage automotive culture. For maybe $15, $20, a kid could bolt on a straight-through muffler pack with fiberglass insulation and transform his grandmother's old sedan into something that rattled windows 3 blocks away. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't supposed to be. The whole point of a Glasspack was announcement. You heard that low, throaty rumble roll down Main Street before you ever saw the car, and that sound told everyone within earshot that someone was coming who wanted to be noticed. Installation was a driveway job, no lift required, just a wrench, a little patience, and maybe a friend to hold the tailpipe steady while you tightened the clamps. Parents hated them. Cops wrote tickets for them. And that, of course, was exactly the appeal. A car with Glasspacks wasn't just transportation anymore. It was a statement, and it cost less than a month of allowance. Then there was the matter of stance, because a car that sounded aggressive but sat flat and boring on its wheels wasn't finishing the job. This is where air shocks came in, and if you wanted to understand the aesthetic ambition of a 17-year-old with $40 in his pocket, you only needed to look at the back end of his car. Air shocks let you pump up the rear suspension with a simple hand pump or, if you were feeling flush, a small compressor, and jack that back end up into the sky. The look was unmistakable, nose down, tail up, an aggressive rake that made even a slow car look like it was ready to launch off the starting line. It was function pretending to be form, or maybe form pretending to be function, because those shocks were marketed for towing and hauling heavy loads, but every teenager in America understood their true purpose was pure visual swagger. You'd see these jacked up land yachts cruising the boulevard, rear ends hiked up like a dog with its hackles raised, and it didn't matter if the car underneath was a Duster or a Dart or something even more modest. The stance did the talking. Of course, once the sound and the stance were sorted, you needed something to look at while you rolled down the street, and this is where the small, cheap, deeply personal touches came in, the stuff you couldn't buy off a shelf so much as you assembled piece by piece over months of allowance money and odd jobs. Fuzzy dice hanging from the rearview mirror were practically a rite of passage, a $5 totem that said this car belongs to someone with a sense of humor and a little bit of rebellion in his blood. They'd come in impossible colors, hot pink, electric blue, leopard print if you wanted to splurge, and they'd swing gently with every turn, a soft little pendulum marking the rhythm of cruising nowhere in particular on a Friday night. Underneath those dice, you might find a dashboard reupholstered in shag carpet, because if you couldn't afford real customization, you could always staple gun some remnant carpet from the hardware store onto your dash and door panels, and suddenly your Pinto felt like a rolling living room. It was cheap, it was a little absurd, and it was entirely theirs. Paint told its own story too, and not the kind of story that required a body shop. Real customization, the kind that professionals charged hundreds of dollars for, was out of reach for most working-class teenagers. But primer gray was free, or close to it, because half these kids were driving cars that were already halfway through a paint job that never quite finished, patches of gray primer covering rust spots and dents like a quilt of good intentions. And for those with a steadier hand and a few dollars more, there was pinstriping, thin, elegant lines of contrasting color hand-painted along the fenders and hood, sometimes done by a buddy who fancied himself an artist, sometimes done with a kit from the auto parts store and a whole lot of nerve. A crooked pinstripe job, applied with shaking teenage hands in a driveway at dusk, was still a pinstripe job, and it still turned a plain car into a canvas. Wheels mattered just as much as paint, maybe more, because wheels were what you saw first when a car rolled past, and real mag wheels, the good stuff, the Craggers and the American racing rims, were expensive, often more than a kid could scrape together. So the workaround became an institution unto itself, the mag wheel simulator, a cheap plastic or metal cover that snapped over your factory steel wheel and mimicked the look of expensive mags for a fraction of the cost. They weren't fooling anyone up close, but at cruising speed, rolling past the drive-in with the windows down, a set of simulators did the job just fine. It was the automotive equivalent of a knockoff watch, and nobody judged you for it, because everybody understood the economics. You spent your real money on the things that made noise and made you go, and you found the cheap version of everything else. And once your car looked right and sounded right, you needed it to feel like yours from the inside too, which meant sound of an entirely different kind, not the exhaust note rolling down the street, but the music filling the cabin while you drove nowhere in particular with your friends packed into the back seat. This is where the 8-track player earned its place as one of the great teenage investments of the decade. A basic under 8-track unit could be had for well under $50, and once it was wired in, a project that usually involved more electrical tape than any responsible adult would recommend, you had a rolling jukebox. You'd build a shoebox of tapes to keep on the passenger floor, trading with friends, arguing about whether Zeppelin or the Stones deserved to be playing when you pulled into the parking lot. And later in the decade, as technology crept forward, some kids graduated to cassette decks, chasing the same dream with slightly newer hardware, but the impulse never changed. The car had to sound like you, inside and out. Now, if music was about personal expression, the CB radio was about connection to something bigger, and it's hard to overstate just how thoroughly Citizens Band radio swept through teenage car culture in the mid-1970s. Movies and songs about truckers and Smokey Bears turned the CB from a niche hobby into a cultural phenomenon almost overnight, and suddenly every kid with a car wanted a handle, wanted to know where the speed traps were, wanted to be part of that invisible network of voices crackling across Channel 19. A basic CB unit and antenna could be installed by any kid with a Saturday afternoon and a manual, mounted under the dash, wired into the fuse box, antenna clamped to the trunk lid or fender. And once it was in, you had a lifeline to every other car on the road, a way to warn your friends about cops, find out where the party was, or just talk to strangers rolling down the same highway in the middle of the night. It made a solitary drive feel like part of a larger community, an entire subculture riding the same radio waves, speaking the same slang, looking out for each other in a way that felt almost like belonging to a secret club that anyone could join for the price of a radio and an antenna. What's remarkable, looking back on all of this, is how little any of it actually cost, and how much it actually meant. None of these modifications required a mechanic or a loan or even much skill beyond what you could learn from an older brother or a library book on car repair. A Glasspack muffler, a set of air shocks, some fuzzy dice, a strip of shag carpet, a can of primer, a pair of wheel simulators, an 8-track player, a CB radio, add it all up and you're talking about a few $100s spread out over months, maybe a summer's worth of mowing lawns and bagging groceries. And yet these cheap, imperfect, occasionally ridiculous modifications gave an entire generation of teenagers something that money alone couldn't buy, a sense of ownership over a piece of the world, a rolling extension of their own identity that they built with their own two hands. There's something almost poignant about it now, decades later, when you consider how disposable it all was and how permanent it felt at the time. Those cars are mostly gone, crushed, rusted away, sold for parts, forgotten in fields behind old farmhouses. The Glasspack stopped rumbling. The air shocks lost their pressure. The fuzzy dice faded in the sun and eventually fell to bits. The CB craze cooled as quickly as it had caught fire, replaced by newer technology that made all that crackling static feel quaint. But for a few years in the middle of the 1970s, in driveways from coast to coast, teenagers were building something real out of spare parts and stubborn creativity, turning ordinary cars into rolling declarations of who they were and who they wanted to be seen as. It wasn't about having the fastest car or the most expensive one. It was about making something yours with what little you had, and there was a kind of dignity in that, a quiet resourcefulness that feels almost foreign in an age when everything can be bought, boxed, and delivered to your door. Those kids didn't have much. But they had wrenches, they had weekends, and they had an idea of who they wanted to be, and sometimes that was enough to turn a beat-up old sedan into something that felt, for a little while at least, like freedom.